Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to what's promising to be the most exciting and interesting panel of the entire Expo. We're delighted to be here. This particular panel is looking at the title, Learning from Indigenous Peoples' Knowledge, Culture and Learning Systems in Creating a More Radically Inclusive Future. Quite a big title, that one, quite a meaty one, but we have the best people to discuss it with us today. And instead of me introducing them, because they know themselves better than I do, and they're way more interesting than I am, I'm just going to go around the panel one by one, and they're going to give a brief introduction of who they are, and we're going to start with Michaela.
Oh, thank you, Colin. My name is Michaela Jade, and I'm a Cabral woman from the Darug-speaking nations of Sydney. There's 38 clan groups in the Sydney Basin, and we all have a common language group. And I've been working in edutech very recently, actually. I was a park ranger for 21 years and recently completed a Master of Applied Cybernetics and have built an Indigenous Edutech company in Australia, and very proud to be here with most of our team from Australia, so thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. A park ranger for 21 years.
Yeah.
What was the most interesting thing you saw in that time?
Probably cutting up a whale on a beach or flying around the Great Barrier Reef in helicopters.
That's, that's fascinating. We'll move over to Fanta. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fana Eve, and I'm the Vice President for Undergraduate Enrollment, Campus Life and Inclusive Excellence at American University in Washington, D.C.
Fantastic. You have to give us a fun fact now after Michaela telling us that you cut open a whale.
Oh, I don't think I can match that. No. A fun fact, maybe something people will know. I was born in Mali, West Africa.
Oh, fantastic. Welcome both of you. And online, we have two wonderful people as well. So I'm just checking if we can, first of all, say hello to Tom. Tom, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Colin. And can I recognise the traditional owners of all the lands and seas and waters that we all come from? Tom Kelmer. I'm from Darwin in the Northern Territory, northern part of Australia, Kongaraka and Iwija on my parents' side, but I live in Canberra, way down the other end of Australia. Do a number of things. I'm a professor at the University of Sydney, but I'm Chancellor of the University of Canberra. But I come here tonight on the panel in two other really important roles that I have, and that's chairing the Australian Literacy, or co-chair the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, which is a philanthropic fund, and also I chair the Living First Language platform, which is a new and very innovative approach to saving Indigenous languages and reteaching them, but empowering the community to take on those roles.
Fantastic, thank you, Tom. Do you ever have time to sleep? How many roles can you actually have?
Oh man, I've hardly covered off on them. I've got a few more, but long days and long nights, and love it all.
Fantastic. Well, we love having you here. Thank you so much for your time. And then finally, last but not least, we have John. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Na kabako wara, na bobugan yaman, na guju, na kabo, na waka waka, barangam neem. My name's John Davis. I'm traditionally from the west of the Bunya Mountains, Cobble, and also grandparent lineage to Vanuatu. I normally have curly hair when it grows. But proud to be coming on today. I'm CEO of Stronger Smarter Institute, one of the longest Indigenous education training institutes in Australia. And I'm also a senior fellow at the Indigenous Knowledge System Lab at Deakin University. Thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure. Thank you, John. And an interesting fact about you, obviously you're equally as busy, but what do you like to do in your spare time, something interesting for the audience?
Well, I've got a number of girls at home now. We've got a family of 9, but now there's all girls of 4. So while we're COVID Zooming and such, I'm also a makeup model for my 5-year-old. She likes to try a lot of different patterns and designs. So there's a fun fact for me. To you all.
So in between the breaks, if you wouldn't mind, could you go off and get made up and then come back? Because I think everybody wants to see what that looks like. With your curly hair as well, it'll be awesome. Wonderful. So I've been instructed by the panel to make this fun. It's a very important, crucial, serious topic, but it's also a topic that we can bring a lot of joy to as well. So that's my instructions, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to kick off with a very important question. I think it's a question, whenever we were talking about this before, that we were all very interested in asking. The question, Michaela, I'll just turn to you first, if that's all right. And the question we discussed was, what does a radically inclusive future of education look like from the perspective of Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, I love this question so much because myself and my brothers online, we descend from the oldest living cultures on earth. So we've had, since time began, cultural knowledge, language and law driving our education system. And it's been pretty successful, I'd say, because we're still here and we're still learning and still driving an education agenda. I think what it looks like for me and for the work that we do in my company in digital is to really flip that narrative of how education occurs in the education system. And as First Peoples and as a Darug woman, we're always being asked to fit into Western systems of education throughout our whole school life and throughout our tertiary education as well. Whereas we're saying, why don't we flip that and why don't we invite other people into the ways of knowing, being and doing that we teach as First Peoples, even in frontier technologies. So looking at how do we bring other people into our way of learning and our way of connecting with our communities and our way of forming relationships together so we can have stronger educational futures that extend not just in the life of our primary, high school, tertiary education, but as lifelong learners together in communities.
Lifelong learners, what does that mean to you?
It means we never stop learning. I'm still learning. I'll be learning until I die, and I'll be learning beyond my lifetime probably with the advent of technologies such as machine learning. My algorithm might be learning for me after I pass away. But yeah, I think never stopping, like in our culture, we're always learning forever. And then we share educational knowledge with younger people that come after us, and they teach us too, and they remind us as well. So I think in the Western education system, there's a hard stop, and you get a certificate and a piece of paper, and then you move on to the next degree or thing that you want to learn, and then that's a hard stop. We don't have hard stops in the way that we teach and learn.
Fantastic, thank you. Fascinating concept, isn't it? The ongoing learning cycle. And,
yeah.
I just want to bring that issue of the flip. You talked about flipping the question, and turn to you, John, if that's all right. John, you mentioned a very interesting phrase before when we were talking, was about learning through culture, not about culture. Do you want to give your point of view in terms of the question that we were asking, in terms of what does a new, radically different education system, inclusive education system, look like from the different perspective?
Thanks, Colin. Have some amazing Indigenous thought leaders here online in that part, and I would humbly just say, recognise that it's the fact that our Indigenous knowledge translations don't need to be vetted against a Western paradigm as they are currently. Like I hear Sister Jade talk about the notion of having our identity up front. These should just be givens in our world and for our young ones coming through in our communities, because we do come from a very rich, one of the oldest living sustaining cultures in the world, and there's deep learning to have and to gain there, and there's ways that our people have. Am I shouting or is that the mic?
It was thrilling. Thank you.
We all got very excited.
I'll speak more softly.
No, just maintain a. I can't hear a thing anyway. No, after.
There's amazing knowledges that our communities have, and we have this concept at Stronger Smarter called the tall trees, and that is no matter the way Western systems try to put us in a box, whether it be a report, a analysis where we continually don't meet a benchmark of non-Indigenous Australians, we know we have tall trees in all our communities who exceed and excel, and you're seeing some of them us online, and the reality is our ways our knowledges are the ones that are going to sustain our people into the future and beyond. And to tap into that identity, to tap into that strength, is what is going to be the deal breaker when it comes to a better global education for our mob.
Fantastic. Put people in boxes. Tell us more about that. Do you mean that the structure is created square holes and trying to knock round pegs into it? Is that what you mean?
More to the point of not being sophisticated enough to pick up a knowledge system. I was just blessed to be yarning with Tom earlier before we jumped on, not being able to understand a knowledge system which has a great relational weave, which goes, like I said, goes back 60,000 campfires about the way we do business, the way we've done business. We have a meeting place there where Tom's based called Canberra, and yet our mob have done that, patterned that in Australia all over. We're from a land map which has over 200 different nations, and that's an amazing, it takes a great political strength and an agility and amazing intellectual capacity to be able to do that without building it around a warring culture or warring environments. It was done on the notions of what we call in my country, wanju, exchanges, exchanging in seasons, exchanging at different times. And there's a great sustainable pattern that really needs to be accented more, which is why Stronger Smarter has got involved in the notion of accenting STEM Indigenous knowledges, and why I'm involved in the recent Deakin University fellowships with Indigenous Knowledge System Labs, because these are the ways for our future, because we need to save the world. You know, the world's getting hotter, the world's resources run out, and what do we need? We need each other to be able to create a better and a more sustainable future. And which better people to get that knowledge or gravitate towards or learn from that knowledge than the oldest living sustaining culture in the world.
Thank you, John. It's fascinating, isn't it? I love the concept of the exchange, and I'm going to turn to Fanta now, and I'm going to pull that thread through that exchange. Fanta, you're particularly interested in looking at decolonization within curricula, within academia, and in colonization, there wasn't an awful lot of exchange, was there? There was an awful lot of take and not an awful lot of given. In your position, and you're wanting to decolonize, which there's a conversation in itself. How do you understand that concept of exchange or lack of?
Great question. I would say, particularly within the work of decolonizing the curriculum, as you mentioned, there was certainly not reciprocity of any kind. It was a one-way approach to how knowledge gets created and what is valuable knowledge and what's the center of knowledge. And so this piece of, thinking and reconceptualizing sort of the radical inclusiveness piece of this really requires that we interrogate what's the base of knowledge and how do we decenter that knowledge in ways that have just been taken for granted, that this is just this is sort of the baseline, and if you do not accept that as a baseline, then you probably are not at the level that you need to be when it comes to knowledge production and knowledge creation. And so from where I sit, in particular, the notion of decolonizing the curriculum is not new. I do think that it has been accelerated and there's a greater sense of urgency, simply because you have students now who are finding themselves in classrooms, and a lot of times they're not seeing their stories being told. They're not seeing their histories being reflected. They're not seeing their cultures being valued. And so as a result, they're really pushing for a change, and it's a change and an urgency in change, because that's, in fact, many will argue, it's incomplete knowledge. And in some cases, it's not only incomplete knowledge, but there's a fallacy in that knowledge that is being, promoted. To give an example, coming from West Africa, Mali, there were anthropologists who would be going to a part of Mali in particular, because for a long time, there's been a central knowledge about cosmology. And anthropologists were coming in year after year after year with really the understanding of, we need to understand this, and we need to understand it from the indigenous communities that are there and that have studied this and in many ways have documented it. The problem is it was, of course, not documented in anything that is in written form, because we live from oral histories. And in coming in, the communities had realized that there was a cooptation and an urgency to co-opt that knowledge. And so what ended up happening, and it was actually documented in many publications by anthropologists in Europe and other places, was this sort of, we've captured this knowledge now, we're able to recreate this knowledge, we're able to disseminate this knowledge, And it literally took decades to understand that what had been documented was false. And the question came up, well, how is that possible? Here you had these anthropologists who had been coming in for years. They had been meeting with the indigenous communities. They had documented this. And what came to be when you went back to the elders and asked, what was wrong with what had been captured? The answer was, we knew that they came and we knew that they were not interested in our ways of life. They were interested in taking the knowledge, but without understanding what is grounding that knowledge. So part of decolonizing the curriculum is really in many ways decentering knowledge that is seen as just taken for granted. And it's a recognition of honoring that knowledge does not belong to one place, one space, and one time, but that in fact knowledge is created all the time, and that indigenous people around the world have been creating knowledge for centuries before Western knowledge became the dominant form of knowledge.
Oh, yeah, round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Can we go out for a beer after this? I want to talk to you for a long time. I just want to focus on one thing that you said there. I could focus on all of it, but in particular, you were talking about the decentering of knowledge, and how do we? And I'm going to throw this question to Tom. Tom, how do you're in a classroom? You look after university. You're in lecture theatres and classrooms. How do you decenter knowledge or accepted knowledge to reflect and to mirror stories and people's histories and backgrounds? How do you do that? How do you even start?
Yeah, well, it's a very challenging situation, actually, and I think for Indigenous peoples the world over, there's a couple of, well, we can't consider that we're all the same. We're very different, whether you're in an urban environment to a rural, remote environment, and so it's really about place-based and understanding where people are coming from and their frame of reference, and look, even though we differ on location, we all have very common ancestry and knowledge. And so, you know, it's working off that base, I think, of understanding. I also co-chair Reconciliation Australia, and that's all about non-Indigenous Australians getting to understand and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples from our knowledge base, and respect that we did have a language. Many still do have language and culture and learnings. We've contributed to massive developments over the years, and in fact, now that people become a little bit more informed and are willing to understand more about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we're suddenly starting to learn that, gee whiz, you know, we looked after the country for millennia before white man came, and in 230 years they've managed to wreck a whole lot of the country that we used to manage. Fire stick farming, is cultural burns is a great example of how we manage the country, and yet we have massive bushfires in Australia that destroy property and people lose their lives. But that's at one level of education. But if we look at the classroom, it's getting people to understand that you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our country were not permitted to practice their own language or cultures. They were forced into understanding and speaking English. And it's only now that we're starting to turn that around a little bit and allowing people to all get a better understanding about Aboriginal people and teaching in the first language, bicultural education programs, and we're starting to see you know, more rapid advancements than we have in the past. But you know, just one quick example. In Australia, our first Indigenous medical doctor graduated in 1983. In North America, New Zealand, it was the 1890s. So there's a big gap because we were denied education and denied access. So I guess making it inclusive, having respect for people's language and cultures and knowledges is a great start, but we've still got a long way to go, and that's part of the decolonisation of the curriculum as well.
Thank you, Tom. What you said was so good, the next room just started clapping. Yes. I don't know if you heard that. Thank you. Look, you know, you touched on two things there. You talked a little bit about, in answer to the question of how do we go about decentering knowledge, you talked about being place-based. So you talked a little bit about the what, the content, and the context of that. I'm going to turn to Michaela now and ask you the second part of what you mentioned was my accent's going to be strong here, the how, the H-O-W, the how, the how. And particularly around the language, because Tom, you also mentioned the language and that bilingual aspect. Mm-hmm. How do you change the way that language is taught, and how do you weave that in?
I love this question. Language is who we are, and as Thiwi, my beautiful sister and colleague, always says, language is our culture. Language ties us to our land. Language has deep and complex meaning. So when I tell you I'm a Cabrogal woman, that means I'm a woman from the place of the cobra grub. The cobra grub, there's a place in Sydney called Cabramatta. That's our place. That's the place in the water where the cobra grub are. And the cobra grub are a medicinal animal that produces antibiotics. So we know where we hear our language as it's tied to our land, where we can find medicine, where we can find food, all of those things. But what I really love about, what I find thrilling about our languages is our elders and our young people are starting to say, what is the new language? What is the new language word for computer? What is the new language word for the cyber future that we might want? What does our language look like in cyber country? Because we have been physically tied to our lands since time began, but now we're in all these other countries, this cyber country, and we need new language around that. And the ability to express what the aspirations are for ourselves in these frontier technologies. What does it look like to be a Cabrogal woman in 20 years in the metaverse? How can we apply our language systems in these new opportunities for education that can extend our reach beyond our country and across the world and to our sister's country and to our brother's country in other places? There are 400 million First Peoples on this planet that hold deep and complex knowledge systems tied to our language. And we're connecting with each other for the first time through the advent of these incredible frontier technologies. But we still have our language, and we can still invent new language. Our language changes over time, and there's this dimension to education that wants to see my people in Laplaps in 1800 before the British arrived. We are so much more than that, and we have the ability to transform and to transform our culture led by our elders into these new places and spaces with new language. And I love a story that Auntie Mary Mudford from the Ngunnawal people shared with me recently. They're revitalising Ngunnawal language, and they made a new word for computer out of their language words for head and hand. So we have the ability to evolve and to change and to drive our educational future agenda through the use of our new languages as well as our past languages.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. Well, yes. I'm going to just take what you said there and just going to pass it to John and throw you the ball here, John. Language is our culture. It's tied to our land. If we're looking at lifelong learning, to pull another thread through this conversation, John, how do you... I'm trying to learn Gaeilge, Irish, at the sprightly age of 46, and I am not good at it. How do you bring language back into lifelong learning as well as into the classroom?
Lovely. I could do my soft speech. Lovely sing outs before. How do we bring life to language? I think was your sing out. Here I am on Yugambeh country. It's a place very metropolitanised, very urban, and they're one of the language base centres for Australia. So they've become very, and we've become very exceptional about re-nesting, redeveloping our languages. Because one thing we are as Indigenous people in Australia, we're the most researched people as well. So there's a leverage point that we have as well when it comes to reconciliation agendas that Tom spoke about, where it's actually a misnomer for a non-Indigenous teacher to say, I don't know, I wasn't told. When we're the most researched people in the world, there's actually a lot of material there to develop and weave in different ways of doing and being. So the languages can be and should be focused on in the highest order and the highest need, because that is a representation of land, and identity is so important, so needed. And with it has to come that notion of communal aspect. I would go back to the notion of process. Regardless if we're going into an AI, a computer technology space, I heard my sister online there talk about country. That's the land as well, country. When we go to new spaces, when it comes to AI, or I think I heard a new frontier mentioned. We do have to be wary on the notion on the notion of frontierism, on breaking new ground. I know our old people, when they put their feet on jar on their land, when they look at Gundia, when they look at the sky, I know they've got those mental maps to look between those stars. I know that because they've shown me that, and they've shown us that through the stories that then get passed on. And it's our responsibility as Nuntali, as teachers, to make sure we're doing that in a way that engages in the next generation. That's a good challenge for all of us online to do, is to always make sure we are bringing it back to the land. Because at the end of the day, too, when it comes to those big floods, when it comes to those big fires, technology can fall, it can let us down as well. So we've got to work out ways that we're less reliant on the technological systems as well. I've seen some very powerful pieces, and Michaela will have more information and lead on this, but I've seen our mob do AI another way. I've seen mob do it relationally. I've seen them do it through the way they do sand talk. And I would sing out a provocation around it's so important as a relational being to decolonize, but more importantly, to recognize country, to center country. It's really important that we do that as us too, us all. We're always looking at making sure the pattern's broader than just me, that there's that notion of two or three or us as a gathering. Because if we don't do that, that's when we get in the trouble. That's the trick, as the old stories tell us, or even the pattern from Western educations I've heard mentioned here, where you start becoming the one or the knower or the container of knowledge, when that was never the pattern that was a part of our country and part of our sustainabilities. Good challenge to have.
So the knower, the container of knowledge, which becomes very dangerous to have that. But so turning to Fanta, with that in mind, that control of knowledge, that locus. And before we mentioned that John's phrase of learning through culture, not about culture, can you do that without creating a locus of control in a classroom or an educational environment?
I would say yes and no, because I think the form of knowledge that we've talked about is passed on from generation to generation. And that happens in spaces that are not our traditional spaces that we think of in terms of the traditional classroom, right? There's a famous historian in Mali by the name of Amadou Hampateba who said, when an elder passes away, it's an entire library that has been burned. And it's this notion that really knowledge and the way in which knowledge gets passed on are from our elders. It is from the elders to the next generation, from that generation to the next. And so our traditional classrooms are not necessarily set up or conducive for that kind of knowledge exchange that we're talking about. Not that they cannot become spaces for it, but there needs to be much more intentional for it to become spaces for the types of knowledge sort of transfer that we're talking about. The second piece about this type of knowledge that was just, talked about is also this notion that there is not an I without a we. As a matter of fact, we were talking about language being one of those important pieces of identity. There are cultures, including in mine, where the notion of I does not exist as a concept. And it's one that's very hard for those in the West to kind of wrap their head around that, right? And so it's this notion of we and the collective we. That in of itself is a powerful metaphor for how knowledge gets created, but how knowledge gets shared, and then how knowledge gets contained and then shared again. So classrooms, yes, but classrooms have to be much more intentional for the type of knowledge that we're talking about. It really needs to recognize that every single one of us are coming from a different perspective, a different ways of life, and that we have something to share. And that is equally valuable, a form of knowledge that we're bringing into the classroom. That is not traditionally how we've been trained, particularly as educators with our pedagogical approaches. So that's the one thing that I would say. The other thing that also has been of concern for me, particularly when it comes to indigenous knowledge and from cultures that go for centuries, is also ensuring this piece of cultural appropriation that happens all too often. And I would go one step further, and that is the commercialization of that type of knowledge. Just to give an example, you had given the example of treatment and cure and what happens. You're seeing now an entire industry that is being formed around what are traditional ways of treating ailments. And I see in many parts of the world that I've been to and that are part of the world that I'm associated with, where you're seeing pharmacology being developed. Much of it is coming from those roots of knowledge. It is going elsewhere in the world. And once it's gone elsewhere in the world, lost in that is what's the origin of this? What's the essence of this form of treatment? How has it been there for centuries? And how has it been discovered? And you can see those being commercialized. And in being commercialized, it is really being made at the level of profit. And that raises the question of what is the sacred part of knowledge? And how do we honor that sacred part of knowledge, given the commercial aspect of what we're seeing, particularly with indigenous forms of knowledge?
Don't ask me that question. Absolutely. And I want to take the first part of what you said there and pass it over to Tom. Tom, we're talking about the roots of knowledge, the origins of knowledge, quite aside from that really important aspect of the commercialization of it, is how do we take that root, how do we create a classroom or an educational environment where we take that root of knowledge and we get rid of the I and we create that we and that passing on, that transfer of knowledge. How do we do that?
Yeah, look, thanks, Cole. I think what's important to recognise is that research world over shows that if somebody is comfortable in their native tongue and they can learn in the very early years within their native tongue and what they're familiar with, that they will advance much more quickly through the education system. And so it's looking at how do we pay respect to people in that environment. In Australia, and I'm sure it's like this elsewhere around the world, we are a vast minority within a majority system. We're 3% of the whole Australian population, except in some of our communities, our remoter communities, where we're much higher percentage. So the approach that we take through the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation is really empowering community members to get engaged in the education system, to try and redress all the difficulties that they had when they were not allowed to participate in the education system, or they had very poor experiences, and to relearn in a supportive environment. And we're seeing massive successes, not only in people's and young kids' abilities to get the foundations to be able to progress through the education system, but also when their social and emotional well-being is very much enhanced. Engaging the parents and carers in the education of their children so that they understand a lot more of the education system takes it away. The thing about language is that under the current system of educating in English, the moment you walk outside the door, you're back into an Aboriginal environment, and you don't necessarily relate to what is in the classroom. So to really advance, we've got to bring both those together. The life experience with the education system. And so a lot of our effort has been, and John's effort too with the principals, but ours is around reorientating teachers, even though they may have a formal university qualification, reorientating the way that they think and unlearn some of what they've learnt so they can better engage with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and minority peoples in the classroom to make it much more inclusive. And that way we're seeing better outcomes in all those locations that we work in.
Oh, thank you so much. If you weren't on a different continent and it wasn't a pandemic and I had your permission, I'd give you a hug. Fantastic. We are at a time where I could talk to you guys for 45 days, not 45 minutes. But we do have people here who I'm sure are burning with some questions as well. So we are going to give the opportunity now for people in the audience to ask questions. I believe there is a microphone I can see through the gloom heading this way. So if you just want to raise your hand if you do have a question, and the microphone will find its way magically to you.
Don't be shy.
We have this awkward moment.
Yeah. There has to be the first person to ask the question.
Not yet. Okay, hold that thought. Oh, yes, sorry, just over here. This gentleman over here in the white shirt. Well done.
This is why people don't ask questions, isn't
Exactly.
it? Big light.
Hi, my name is Antonio Copete. I'm a university representative from Colombia. We're in Colombia, in Latin America. We have, of course, a long history of dialogue between different cultures, especially indigenous communities, and from cultures who have colonized afterwards. I was wondering about what you could say about the dialogue between indigenous culture and other foreign cultures in the context of science and science education, because of course there's some approaches that sort of disregard a lot of the indigenous knowledge as non-scientific and kind of opposed to the methods that are taught in science. So what could you say about that context of science education?
Great question, thank you.
I really love that question. Do you mind if I speak?
No, I'm going to give it to somebody else. Yeah, of course you can.
Thank you for that. It's such a great question. So we have mentioned Uncle Tom and Uncle John online. I've also mentioned that we're the oldest living cultures on Earth. We are scientists. Our knowledge is science. I have 2 degrees that are scientific degrees from Western institutions. And at that time is when I was acknowledged as a scientist, even though I descend from a culture that has been... I've got to talk to this camera. Sorry, I want to talk to you because you asked the question.
And he's very good looking as well. I understand, but you've got to go that way.
But yeah, why do we wait for our mob to earn a university degree in a scientific qualification that is served to us in a Western system before we acknowledge our science as being a valid science? Our science is valid science. We understand very complex systems, biological systems, geographical system, hydrological system, any kind of science you can describe in your Western institutions. We have deep understanding of that as First Peoples across the world. We don't need to wait until we go through a tertiary system to get a qualification to be recognised as scientists. And I understand the importance of getting a degree. As I mentioned, I have 2 in science, but I really am getting to a point in my life where I don't want my daughters to feel like they can't count themselves as holding important in scientific knowledge unless they go and get a science degree. I think we really need to change that for our knowledge systems. I mean, as Uncle Tom said and Uncle John, we're the most researched peoples in the whole world. People come and travel long distances to spend vast amounts of time documenting our sciences for their own benefit. Now, if our science is not valuable and not valid, why are they doing that? And why have they been doing that for centuries?
Good question. Fanta, John, Tom, would anybody else like to follow up on that?
I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think you said it all.
Thank you. Gents on screen.
Yeah. Just on that, and particularly in Panama and South America as around the world, we had science, but it wasn't in the same form as Western science. And that's why a lot of these countries are coming in to try and understand our relationship with land, with plants, the whole biology, not for humanity's good, it's for exploitation. And some of these things we hold ourselves and we don't necessarily want to share them because they will be abused. But we look at our whole, what we call nunkeries or traditional healers over here. And they're the same in other parts of the world where they have a science that's able to heal people and help people survive both physically and emotionally, which is not a Western science, but you know, we value that. And I think more and more Western world is starting to understand that value. And you know, it's about us now trying to protect our intellectual property and the provenance of our knowledge.
John, are you happy with that? Anything else you want to add?
Oh, just to concur with what everyone's spoken on. Just one thing I would sing out with Stronger Smarter is pushing the paradigm around the non-Indigenous teacher, who is the majority. Our people see a non-Indigenous teacher in front of them before they'll see our people in the same numbers. So one thing that we've worked on is just being really clear and upfront that as the most research people, the fact that we have this national Australian curriculum, that there is this opportunity to really put up Indigenous knowledges at the forefront. And in science, it's already been proven in Australia around inquiry. Our young ones have shown that internationally on the PISA data that they have an amazing expanse, aptitude, appetite for science inquiry, and that opportunity then is on the institute, is on the education systems to match that, and that's the challenge. That is the challenge that we face, is that it's not fast enough to match, because I'm a Indigenous languages expert, Indigenous history teacher expert. Science isn't my quality, but my Barong country, we fought for 4 rangers to be looking after the country, Bubuganyaman, and I have a very high science aptitude about how the tracking data is used, how we go about firing country. So that skill set isn't just for me or Tom or SIS Online. It's patterned all over the country. So for us, it's about education systems catching up, because we're ready. And look at this amazing mob you got there in Dubai in front there at the moment. Our mob are going to go even further in front. So it's about catching up.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you. We have 2.5 minutes. Does anybody have a quick question that they would like to ask? Otherwise, I've just asked the lady in the front row there. There was a mic, hurtling towards you.
So am I allowed to turn around?
Only if you're
Thank you so much. Hello, I really try to keep that short. Maybe you touched the topic because I came a little bit later, but I'm educational psychologist. I work in Tallinn University in Estonia, and my work is to support teachers in teacher training. And the last years I'm coming to the thought that I don't see anywhere in teachers training or in school curriculums that we want to teach intrinsic value of nature. We don't want to teach it. This is not a topic in Estonian curriculum. As a psychologist, I have this scientific question: what is it? Can we develop it? Can we teach it? Should we teach it? And maybe from Indigenous people and education and culture, maybe you have ideas how to teach it to people who don't live inside of nature. What are the ways or the paths toward learning to value that? Because I think this is what the world needs today.
Wonderful question. You have 45 seconds to answer that question.
Go, Auntie. This is yours.
I would say specifically for teachers who then really are for students, there is no substitute for the experiential part of this. There really isn't. This is now one of those moments where the book learning is going to get, I think, teachers there. It really needs to be fully immersive learning that is experiential learning. It has to be that. Sometimes we often say the best learning comes from doing, and it is absolutely the case that when it comes to the piece of nature, it has to be via doing and being rather than book learning.
Thank you so much. You did that within 40 seconds. That was amazing. Great question. We are going to wrap it up. It's been an absolute pleasure. My name's Colin. I'm from Creative HQ in New Zealand. Obviously, this issue is absolutely crucial to us as well as we live through it. But I just want to say a massive thank you to Michaela, to Fanta, to the 2 best looking men in the room up on the screen,
Yes.
to John.
Thank you.
As well. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and a huge round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.